Warning. The following episode discusses the year 2000 horror film Cabin by the Lake and contains discussions of violence, including graphic descriptions of murder and drowning. A complete list of content warnings can be found in the episode description. Please, proceed with caution. Stanley Caldwell did nothing wrong. Hello and welcome to the Most Maligned Horror Podcast, a show offering critical analysis and contextualization of the horror films of the early 2000s. I am your host, Macaulay Elijah Quinn. I am a filmmaker and film critic, and on today's episode I'll be discussing with you February 2000's made-for-TV slasher Cabin by the Lake, a film about filmmaking, a film that is very condemnatory of the Hollywood studio system and the ways that it takes an artist's work and transforms it into something lesser. Cabin by the Lake is a film that really surprised me. I didn't know much about it going in. I didn't have a huge amount of expectations, but watching it, I was actually really taken aback by just how engaging it was, how involved I found myself becoming. The plot synopsis for the film that I found presented it as being a film that follows the victim of an attempted murder who teams up with the local police department to try and catch the killer, and that is partly what the film is about, but more accurately, this is a film about an artist's struggle to fit into a studio system, or the studio system, I suppose. I opened this show with the line, Stanley Caldwell did nothing wrong, the joke being that Stanley Caldwell is a serial killer responsible for the deaths of 5 girls and the attempted murder of another. Stanley Caldwell is the film's true protagonist, antagonist, I've called him. And he is a kind of intellectual artist. That is to say that he has a really deep love for the artistic process. The finished product is in some ways less important than the act of creation. The one time that he shows any sort of real passion in the film is in the scenes where he's writing, when he's creating. Otherwise, he is a very cold, very detached figure. And we see this from basically right at the beginning of the film, in the film's opening kill sequence, where Stanley is just toying with his victim. You know, he is lying to her, he is constantly pestering her with questions throughout the entire process of binding her and bringing her out onto the lake. Even when he pushes her into the water, he forcibly drags her back out by the hair just to get one final look at her, to try and to interpret her emotional state. And all of this is being done under the guise of research for the screenplay that he's working on called Garden of Flesh, which is sort of the film within this film. In some ways, this is a very post-Scream sort of slasher film, in that it is a film about filmmaking. It is a horror film about horror films. It is a film about how films are made. You know, it looks at who are the people behind these works and sort of what actually drives them to create these artistic works that are, deliberately confronting, deliberately abrasive. While I enjoyed a lot of the technical aspects of this film, I enjoyed a lot of the individual shots and the plotting of the film, a lot of the performances I found to be really great. What was most compelling to me were the themes that I have laid out here. And what I was most engaged with was the ways that the filmmakers were engaging with these themes, how they were presenting these themes. Because what I ended up feeling by the end of this film was that the filmmakers they do not approve of Stanley's actions. That is to say, they do not approve of Stanley's his killings. What they did empathize with was his inability to work within this system, his disdain for the Hollywood studio system. The filmmakers, they too seem to truly despise it. Throughout the film, there are a number of examples of the vapidity of the Hollywood system, of the executives, of the higher-ups, the people who are commissioning Stanley to create his Garden of Flesh. Stanley is a work-for-hire writer. That is, this was not originally his story. Somebody else came up with the idea, and he is now just being paid to put together a draft, to expand the idea across 90 pages. But what we also see is that Garden of Flesh, the film within the film, it is already in production at this stage. They're already commissioning props, they're already scouting locations. The budget for the film hasn't even been decided, we find out at one stage. From the jump, this is a very rinky-dink production. Now that I think about it, even the makeup effects artists are presented as being somewhat vapid. The guy at least has an abiding love for what might be called lower art. In the first scene where we're introduced to these characters, they are watching a slasher film, which we are supposed to understand is just basically a sort of gore film, just an excuse to watch teenagers be killed. Stanley even comments that they don't make good films anymore, and he demands to know who writes this sort of crap, and the overwhelming response is, "You do." So in this scene, we're seeing Stanley be belittled, or seeing his writing be belittled. And while it all seems to be in good fun, it is just yet another example of a Hollywood professional who is dismissive of his intellectualizing of art. One of the earliest scenes that stuck out to me in the film was when we cut to Stanley's agent's office in Los Angeles. This film had been described as cozy by a number of critics, and I have to agree with them. This is a very, very comfortable film in a lot of ways. It is a film that is very, very warm. It is very clear that they were shooting on location in a lot of cases. The effect that this has, though, is that when we cut to sets, it becomes very clear, very obvious that they are sets, and that they were sets that were made on the cheap. The agent's office is the most obvious example of this. It is very, very sparsely decorated. It is very, very cold. There is not much going on visually. And some of this is clearly budgetary. Obviously, they had some restrictions around what they could spend and where they could spend it. But it does give these scenes a certain vibe, a certain point of difference. Let's say they contrast very clearly with the scenes shot at the lake, or anywhere in this town where the majority of the film takes place. Intentional or not, it does give the impression that Hollywood is a very cold place, not temperature wise, but emotionally, it is a place that has very little feeling, very little respect for humanity. We also see this in the frankly monstrous way that Stanley's agent is characterized, is presented throughout the film, and the director as well of Garden of Flesh. These two characters are both, in some ways, more monstrous, more evil than Stanley in the filmmaker's eyes. You know, Stanley is a serial killer, yes, and what he does is abhorrent, but these two characters, they are just demented, truly unhinged. They don't, they are unable to see. They're unable to see what is right in front of them in a lot of cases. Throughout the film, they are characterized as spineless and nagging and snooty. And again, I think that this is meant to be understood as commentary on the studio system. I think that these characters in humanity is meant to be understood as representative of an issue that is larger than themselves, one that is, you know, just inherent to Hollywood and into the way that it treats the artists working within it. The final scene of the film sees Stanley sitting down with another Hollywood executive pitching a story. And Stanley, throughout the scene, is dressed in just a truly awful wig and fake beard. He looks just cartoonish in a really particular way. And I don't know how intentional this was. Whether it was just whether it was, again, a result of budgetary constraints, whether they just simply couldn't afford better effects, better makeup for this sequence, or whether it was a deliberate choice by the director. In some ways, it doesn't matter. But what we see is that this executive that Stanley is meeting with, she just buys all of this hook, line, and sinker. And Stanley is acting very, very strangely. He is very peculiar in the scene, as well as the way that he is dressed, as well as his appearance. He is also acting in a very unhinged sort of way. He is engaging with this woman physically in a way that is, you hate to see it. He's really just getting into her space in a way that any sane person would understand as undesirable, let's say. Instead, though, this woman she loves it. She just sees it all as as performance. And the final shot of the film is Stanley turning to camera, just looking, straight down the barrel of the lens, as if to say, can you fucking believe this? Like, how is she buying this? Like, I am putting it on so thick, and she is just absolutely loving it. One of my earliest notes was on the soundtrack for the film. It was just simply, say what you see. The lyrics for a number of the songs throughout the film are very, very literal. And at first, I didn't really know how to interpret this. This is kind of a staple of these sorts of made-for-TV movies. A lot of them use music as a way to sort of fill in the gaps, to paper over some of the holes in the story by just having a musician tell you what it is you're supposed to be feeling or what you're supposed to be taking away from a scene. And so that was initially sort of how I took it, but thinking about it now, in context with the rest of the film and in context with how I believe the filmmakers, the message that the filmmakers are trying to convey with it, I think that we're meant to interpret these songs as being written from Stanley's perspective. The scene that made all of this click into place for me was the sequence where Stanley is escaping from the police after discovering the prop Mallory that has been set up as bait in the trap meant to capture him. The song that plays talks about escape. It is singing from Stanley's point of view. It is rooting for him to get away. This might be the most obvious example, but the other scene that made this all click into place for me was the sequence where Stanley is mimicking Mallory's actions from behind a pane of two-way mirror. At first, it would seem as though we are hearing Mallory's inner monologue, that these lyrics are a literalizing of her emotional state. But as it goes on, it sort of became clear to me that instead what we're seeing, or what we're hearing rather, is a literalizing of Stanley's interpretation of her emotional state. What we're hearing is the meaning that he has imparted to her actions. To sort of paraphrase one of my favorite critics, Sean McTiernan, serial killers create their own context. They create a perspective on the world that they are then imposing on other people through their actions. And I think that that's what Stanley is doing in this scene, and I think that that's what the music is doing in this scene by extension. This is what I mean when I say that the filmmakers, I think, they don't endorse Stanley's actions, but they do, I think, they understand his sort of his drive, his motivation, why he does the things that he does. To sort of close off this episode, I think I would like to talk about money. I think that it's interesting to think about this film in terms of its monetary value. Does its lower budget make it more or less respectable? Does the fact that it was made on the cheap affect how we as viewers receive it and interpret it? At one point in the film, Stanley meets with his agent and with the director of the film within the film, Garden of Flesh, and he gets into a heated argument over the budget for the film, whether or not it should be made for more or less money. And his argument is that if they are to make Garden of Flesh as an art film, then it should surely be made with a lower budget. So immediately we are seeing that the idea that profit or some sort of profit motive is in some way antithetical with high art. Now, I argue all the time for the value of lower budget independent cinema, and not monetary value, but just sort of creative value, moral value. On this show, even I have made this argument on Take Two over at patreon.com/Most Maligned. I have talked about the ways in which these lower budget films are allowed in some ways to be more experimental and to be more exciting than a lot of pop art, because they don't have these sorts of financial obligations, because they don't have as much oversight as a lot of higher budget films do. The difference, I suppose, between myself and the makers of this film is that I don't believe that a lower budget makes a film inherently virtuous. There is lower budget art that is bad. We're going to be talking about some of it very soon on this show, actually. This film really did fascinate me. In the few days that it's been since I initially watched it, I've been thinking about it an awful lot. I didn't talk about it much in this episode, but this is a really good-looking film. It's a very, very well-constructed piece of work. Right, I think that'll do it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Janka Glonis for the use of her track Slime Dripping Down the Walls off of the album Funtime Party Gal. A link to that album and to their Bandcamp can be found in the episode description. If you have any comments or queries regarding the show and you want to get in touch, you can do that on Twitter at Most Maligned or via email mostmaligned@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd ask that you please consider supporting the show at patreon.com/mostmaligned, where for just $5 a month you'll receive exclusive access to Take Two, a semi-weekly show offering critical analysis and contextualization of those films which have not made it onto the main feed. If you head over there this week, you'll find a discussion of the January 2000 Italian SOV possession film The House with Arched Windows, a film that really surprised me. It was a really tremendously good-looking film, one of the best that I've seen in quite some time. If you could please leave a rating and review on your podcasting platform of choice, I would really appreciate it. Good word of mouth is very important for helping to increase this show's listenership, especially in these early days. Next week on the main show, we'll be discussing February 2000's Scream 3, arguably one of the best Scream films. But until then, this has been the Most Maligned Horror Podcast.